Hello, my name is Chris Hill. I'm the Chief Executive and Chairman of the Board of Cindy XR. Welcome to our WellnessJourney.LIFE interview series. Today, we are joined by best-selling author Ken Stern. After serving as Chief Executive Officer of National Public Radio, Ken founded the Longevity Project, which fosters public conversation and research on the topic of longevity. His latest book, Healthy to 100, How Strong Social Ties Lead to Long Lives, it's just been published. And I want to thank you, Ken Stern, for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me on the show.
Well, it's great to see you. Well, let's start with the end in mind, shall we? In your book, you identify a number of ingredients associated with longevity. And if you don't mind, I'd like just to read a passage that really struck me from your book. Quote, if you want to come up with a recipe for successful aging, you need to start with the key ingredient, and that is the nature of your relationships and your social connections, unquote. Ken, what is social health, and why is it so important to longevity?
Yeah, so let's, it's a great question, Chris. Let's take a step back. I think as Americans, we've been largely trained to think of our life expectancy and our healthy life expectancy as being a function of fitness, nutrition, access to healthcare, even genetics. And all those things matter. But what we haven't really put in the equation is the importance of social connection to health. And I think we've learned over the last 20 years that being lonely is a great risk to our health. It's the research shows it's roughly equivalent to being lonely is roughly equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And conversely, being socially connected, being out and about, being connected, being engaged with the world, with others, to having purpose in life is positively correlated with longer life expectancy, better health, lower risks of cancer and heart disease, and better cognitive health. And part of the message of my book is we need to treat social connection on the same level as we do with other aspects of physical and cognitive health if we're going to both individually and collectively get healthier.
Indeed, you mentioned that our bodies react to stress with increased inflammation. Chronic stress leads to cardiovascular disease, et cetera, caused by loneliness. I guess, Ken, the question is, in an age of full connectivity, be it social media, it seems like we're more connected than ever. How is it possible that we have a loneliness epidemic?
Yeah. Well, it's actually, the irony of the modern age that all these communication devices we have are making us less communicate. We communicate with devices now and not with people. My son's generation, I have an 18-year-old son, senior in high school. His generation spends an hour less a day with friends than my generation does. The number of people who report having no friends has skyrocketed. The number of people who report having 10 or more friends has collapsed. All the institutions that typically bring us in contact with other religious organizations, unions, sewing circles, PTA, book clubs, Elks clubs, all have been in long-term decline. And that's the irony of that, Chris, is that's the result of us spending a lot more time with our communication devices and less with humans. First with television, when Bob Putnam, a professor at Harvard, wrote Bowling Alone. He wrote that, and I think it came out in 2002, but he was studying in 1980 when television became ubiquitous in the US. And that's when all the time we spent with humans started to decline as we spent more time first with television and now with phones. And all that has created this crisis of loneliness, even as we're in the most connected society on earth.
And it's interesting. You mentioned in your book, Ken, the Harvard study of adult development that goes back 9 full decades, where there's a lot of metrics coming out of it: blood draws, MRI studies, behavioral data. What are some of the learnings from that study, and how does that relate to present day?
Yeah. It's an incredible study. So this is a study, the Harvard study of adult development, began in the 1930s. When researchers at Harvard decided they wanted to find out what makes people happy and healthy, sort of a fundamental question about life. And what they did was they recruited roughly 200 male students at Harvard, I think they were sophomores at the time. And then they also recruited about the equal number of similarly aged young men from less economically advantaged parts of Boston. And their goal was actually to follow these people throughout their life course and contact them regularly and do medical studies, but also studies of what made them tick, their lives, their social networks, their social engagement. And it's an extraordinary thing. One thing is the original Harvard group included John F. Kennedy and also Ben Bradley, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, the legendary editor of the Washington Post. And that study's been going on for 90 years now. All the original cohort has died, of course, but they've been following the kids and now the grandkids and maybe the great-great-grandkids of the original group. And now at almost a century old, this is the longest latitudinal study in American history. And what they found over the course of almost a century of research, Bob Waldinger, who's the fourth director of the study and is now the current director, said really happiness and success on a personal level really comes down to a simple equation: the quality of the relationship with the person next to you. It's not your access to healthcare. It's not how much money you make. It's really that simple quality of your social relationship starting with the person who you're closest with. And that's a fundamental finding about what makes us happy and healthy that we really need to think about more as we think about what we individually want to achieve, as we think about how we age.
It's fascinating, given the technology world that we live in, with the wearables and tracking all manner of metrics, and some level of individual agency. You're saying that it's a conversation of the timeless aspect of human connection that really makes a difference here, and that's what social health really means. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I will never tell you, Chris, that you shouldn't be thinking about nutrition and exercise and healthcare. All those things matter. But social connection matters enormously. And for me, social connection is not just about your connection to other humans. That's a big piece of it. But it's also having purpose, meaning, reason to get out of the bed in the morning. Those things we're social creatures. We've been since came out of the primordial ooze or whatever, or we walked out of the water. We've really relied on others for protection, for meaning, for purpose, for our humanness. And that's true today as it was, 600,000 years ago.
In your book, Ken, you clearly have a love of travel, as do I. And it's amazing how much we learn when we travel, learn about other cultures, about other habits, about other just ways people interact. And you mentioned in your book, quote, "In the world's longest living societies, community isn't optional. It's built in daily life." Could you give us a few examples of what you experience and what we can learn from them?
Of course, Chris. So the construct of my book was it wasn't always the case that the U.S. had a life expectancy disparity with the rest of sort of our peer nations. If you go back to 1980, when social connections started to pull apart. We weren't the longest lived country in the world, but we weren't the shortest lived country in the world among economically advanced countries. We are today, and not by a small amount. And that's the pressure of technology. Now, we're not the only country that is suffering from the impact of technology on our social connections, but we're the ones that's felt it the most. And I wanted to go to other successful aging countries, find out what they're doing. And they live with sort of the challenge of technology. You get on the subway in Seoul or Singapore, and people are face down in their phones just as they are here. But what those countries have done far more than we have, they've made social health, especially in the second half of life, a critical component of public health. And so they've set up programs. I mean, the UK has a minister of loneliness. So does Japan. They've set up programs and public constructs to ensure that people have the opportunity and have a social norm of connecting with others. And they do it all differently. In Japan, it's a lot about access to work, mostly part-time work in the second half of life. In Korea, it's about lifelong learning. In Italy, it's a lot about volunteering. And in Singapore, it's all of the above, plus the importance of intergenerational relationships. But all the thing that connects them is they've all put the idea that, hey, healthcare matters, exercise, nutrition matter, but we really got to make sure that humans are connected to other humans and have the opportunity to flourish as humans throughout the life course.
You mentioned Singapore and the importance that they put on intergenerational relationships, the Singapore way, if you will. It occurs to me, when I was growing up, my grandmother lived with me, and there were sort of stronger connections. Have we lost our way regarding that in the United States?
Yeah. So if you turn the clock back 120 years ago, and really for almost, and before that, for all of human history, we lived in multi-generational communities. In the U.S., still, until the turn of the century, it was a largely agrarian economy. People grew up on the farms. They lived in multi-generational communities. They worked together in multi-generational units. The 20th century, with urbanization and greater mobility, we really lost that. And we created essentially a civic norm around the idea that, in fact, when you hit 18 or 21, you got to leave the house. There's something wrong with you. You didn't. And then we created this idea of retirement communities starting in the 1950s. Didn't exist before. The idea that you would leave the community of your lifetime and move to the burning desert in Arizona or to Florida and live with only people of your age. It's a very anti-evolutionary idea that we developed during the 20th century. And it's hurt us. It's pulled the generation apart. My friend Mark Friedman always says the generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And it turns out a lot of the research shows that generativity, putting the generations together, are good for the health of older folks and the purpose of older folks. It's also really critical to the development of younger people as well. And we've lost that to a great degree, and we need to recapture that. Other countries never lost in the same way. You don't find 55 plus communities in other countries, really. But others have made it sort of like in Singapore, made it a centerpiece of social policy to keep the generations together, even if sort of mobility and modernity wants to pull them apart.
It's interesting. It sounds like a real commitment by countries and societies for this, very intentional. You also referenced the importance of continuous education. Are you seeing more of a commitment throughout the world to engage communities, particularly 50 plus communities around continuous education?
Yeah, for sure. So you see it in a lot of places. So Singapore, for instance, has a what they call, I think, life skills credit that basically makes lifelong learning free up to a certain degree for virtually everyone in the city, in the country. But I wrote about it mostly in Korea because they're kind of maniacal about the idea that learning is something you do across the life course. It's not something you do in high school and college then stop. It's something you need to do both for professional development and sort of active citizenry and throughout the life course. It's actually a constitutional right in Korea. The idea of lifelong learning is in the Korean constitution. Sort of a strange concept for me, used to the idea of constitutional rights of not having troops quartered in your house as we do. So what they've done in Korea is they've built this very thick network of what they call lifelong learning cities. So virtually every city in the country has applied to the Ministry of Education to be designated a lifelong learning city. And they've built this lifelong learning institutes in every city, which puts, in most cases, classrooms in every neighborhood in the country. And so that no one of any age will be more than 5 or 10 minute walk, at least in an urban setting, from a classroom, and the opportunity to take a course. And the social norms develop, like that's something you do. It's good for you. It gets you out of the house. It gets you cognitively engaged. It brings you in community with other people. And it's good for participation in citizenry, right? That's the social norm. So you see lots and lots of people doing that. The interesting thing, Chris, in the US, most of us, ARP has done a lot of research on this. Most of us think of ourselves as lifelong learners, but what we do often is solitary. So when ARP asks people, what do you do for your lifelong learning? We reply, reading alone and watching cable news. pros and cons of those things, but they don't get us out of the house. They don't bring us in community with other people, and that is a challenge. The opportunity is there's actually lots of opportunities in the U.S. to learn even as we age. Most states make their public universities either free or significantly reduced in terms of tuition for older people, over 60 or 65. There are community colleges, there's things called the OLLIs, the Osher Lifelong Learning Centers, that are attached to 120 universities. But we don't have the culture of getting people out and about and thinking of learning as something we do at all stages of life.
You know, it's interesting as you talk through it, Ken. Clearly, these are nice things to do. These are good human things to do. But it occurs to me that there's a real economic benefit. I mean, getting down to bottom line, you referenced a number of countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore. We're living in an age where the birth rates are at historical lows. Just from a straight economic benefit, is that a big part of why countries and societies are making this push?
Yeah, so there's a certain amount of demographic urgency in places that are longer lived with us. So take Japan, the longest lived country on earth. Median life expectancy for women there are now is now exactly 90, which is sort of an extraordinary thing. And combine that with declining birth rates, what you see is a country in which the traditional labor force of 18 to 64 is in decline. So they know as sort of an economic necessity that they need to keep older people active, encourage work, and also healthier, because they won't be able to afford the tremendous cost of healthcare if people are old and infirm. So, and in Japan's kind of an interesting case study, because until about 20 years ago, it had the most rigid work system, one of the most rigid work systems in the country. I mean, you hit 60 or 65, and you're out. You were forced into retirement. And what has developed since is actually sort of this amazing story where not only are companies creating essentially a second work environment, a lot more part-time work, job sharing, high use of assistive technology. Older workers older people really believe the importance of work as for their own purpose, their own social connection, get out of the house, to have meaning in life, to contribute. And people want to work because they think of that as a personal good. So there's something called the Silver Genzai Human Resources Agency. It represents 1 million older workers in Japan between the ages of 64 and 106, I believe, 65 and 106. And they only place them in part-time jobs. It's the only thing they do. And they've worked with companies around the country and with governments to ensure that that type of opportunity exists for older workers. And they've polled their workers, the members of Silver Genzai, and 80% tell them they want to work not because of economic reasons, but because of social reasons, because it is their fundamental belief that it's good for their health and their well-being. And that's just a huge change, and really just a generation from what has gone on before.
You know, it's fascinating. In this conversation, Ken, there's a number of paradoxes. We mentioned earlier how connected everybody are, yet there's a loneliness epidemic. And that's borne out by, you know, as I mentioned before in our prior conversation, the CDXR wellness community, you know, as they get together and they talk about their situation, whatever that may be, instead of talking about A1C and blood pressure, they're talking about things like loneliness, which totally backs up your thesis. And that gets to me a question, which is, you mentioned healthcare expenses. So we know that in some ways we are in a healthcare crisis. The level of expense being paid by individuals and companies is really off the charts. There's a lot of debate about how we fix that. In an age where we're tracking everything, that crisis exists. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how do we square the current healthcare environment that we live in with the thesis of your book? Is there some aspect of personal agency that needs to happen for them to take their own longevity in hand here, given that a lot of times people waiting to present a problem? How do we, the question is, how do we rectify that with individual agency?
So I think the research shows that health takes place outside the doctor's office. And again, not to minimize the important role that health doctors and healthcare systems play in keeping us healthy or keeping us alive, but it's pretty clear, and you see it else in the world, that the best thing we could do in terms of healthcare is make people stay healthy and need doctors less. So a lot of the things we're talking about here is, in terms of social connection, they're not cures. They're a way to keep you healthy, active, engaged, so you need less access to healthcare in the future. And I think, people say a lot, we have a sick care system in the US, not a healthcare system, because we don't use enough assets for invested prevention. And I think generally that's commonly accepted as true, that we need to invest more in helping people stay healthy so they need less of this $3 trillion economy that we've developed around healthcare. You see, I have a partnership with the lifestyle medicine program at Stanford. That's their thing, right? They're not there to treat people. They're to help people treat themselves, so they don't need doctors in the first place. And I think, that fits hand in glove with the idea of social connection being a preventative approach, not a curative approach.
What really strikes me, Ken, is the sustainability of your thesis of social health in your recommendations. What I mean by that is we've all heard about the pluses and minuses of certain diets, the Mediterranean diet, eat this, only eat that. We're now going through the Ozempic world where as long as you get the shot and then you're going to be fine. It occurs to me that your reframing of this around social connection seems to be more sustainable. And what I mean by that is if I'm having lunch with a loved one or a friend or old colleague and I'm getting up and taking the steps to the coffee shop, there is a win-win environment there that is almost a partnership as opposed to the one-off of individual dieting, individual certain other methods. So it sounds like you have a more sustainable approach.
Well, I think if we can build social connection, I think the challenge is all the metrics of social connection are going the wrong way in this country. If we can sort of reframe that, build what I think of as sort of a social health infrastructure to help people, make it easier for people to connect, give them opportunities for connection. Yeah, I think that tends to support everything about social connection, supports a broader aspect. It gets you out of the house, you're moving. You're responding more to social cues. One of the risks of loneliness is you don't have sort of the social cues about taking care of yourself. So being out and about will give you social cues about how to take care of your own health, to eat right, to exercise. All those things are important and are lost if you're lonely and socially isolated. So there's definitely a self-reinforcing system there that I think is sustainable, but we also have a challenge of combating the rise of loneliness in this country, what Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, called the loneliness epidemic in this country.
Well, Ken, if you could put your futurist hat on as you look forward, there are a number of challenges that we face geopolitically, individually, et cetera. If you put your futurist hat on and you look forward, what gives you hope that that individuals will take that agency to do some of the things you recommend, focus on their social health, focus on their continuous education, focus perhaps on doing some more travel and learn from that experience? What gives you hope as you look forward?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to, I think, spark some hopefulness, even if the data tends to run in the wrong direction. The first is, I think we've gotten, I tend to think of social connection has now actually, people have begun to understand the importance that social connection plays in health. We've gotten to a point where it's like the weather. Everyone talks about it, no one does anything about it. But that's a plus, right? We're talking about it, we're thinking about it. I write an advice column, God help us all, on social connection. People are really interested in it. There are others out there talking about it that I think, to me, is a marker of a change in social attitudes about the importance of social connection. So that's one great thing we're starting to talk about and think about it. The second thing is, when you go off and write a book about what other countries are doing to be healthy, you tend to sort of lionize what they do and minimize what we do. So all these things they're doing in Singapore is fantastic. All the things that are happening in sort of urban design in Spain is fantastic. Those countries also have challenges too. And conversely, there are actually a lot of programs in the US to support social connection and more every day. The challenge we have is that they tend to be relatively small, not scalable, not connected with each other. It doesn't have it's not part of a formal policy of public health. And I think that's our next stage, is to elevate this above the personal and really commit to it as society. And I think a lot of good will come, not just our personal health and well-being, but I think it's a civic good to bring people together. I've written books about political polarization before and the risks that faces to the country. And that's because that comes from people spending less and less time with each other and imagining all the bad things about each other, that the people that we don't see. So I think there's both a personal and civic good that comes from getting humans in front of other humans.
Another data point, perhaps, even as we tend to focus when we talk about longevity of people in their perhaps second half of the life, I note with interest for some of the younger folks out there, the folks that were in college. I know my daughter just graduated with her master's from the new school, but she started her first semester in the school, not in the new school at New York, but in our bedroom upstairs in her, because she was the COVID generation. And I remember the look on her face when she said, this is no way to interact. And when we're able then to go back to school, and all the students came back to school, how important that personal connection was, even for those that are online first and perhaps social media first. So that perhaps gives us some hope as well, that the innate, and that's one of the things I love about your book, the innate human aspect of connection. It's all inside of us, and we have to make sure that technology does get in the way. And I hope that that's also a data point as folks, even the younger folks, start progressing through their life. Would you say so?
Oh, I would think so. So I think COVID, it's really, I think, correct of you, Chris, to mention the lessons of COVID. Obviously, the harm that it brought to a generation of kids who were divided from other kids. I saw it with your daughter. I saw it with my son, a few years younger than your daughter. The struggle that created, the harm, the physical harm that created. We also saw it with older folks. We thought the right thing to do was bubble wrap older folks and keep them away from each other. And medically, that was probably right, and maybe even that was the right decision. But we also saw the deep harm that it did, often killed people just from isolation and loneliness. And that was a real, I think, for me, a real marker of the health costs of dividing people, the direct, human costs of that, not just in making them depressed and lonely, but actually killing people as they divide from other people. I went to one of the places I went to in my travels was a city in northern Italy called Bergamo. And Bergamo, to the extent it's a lovely sort of untouched city in northern Italy, beautiful place to visit. But it's most famous now as being ground zero for the first outbreak of COVID in the Western world. It was a terrible, devastating. No one knew what it was. It was really the first place. People died. They had to stop ringing the bells when people died because there were just too many. And the interesting thing came out of this was you might think that what Bergamo would do after COVID was try to bubble wrap their older population and keep them separated and immunized from the risks that other people pose to them. But they've gone the opposite direction. They've actually gotten rid of senior centers and created centers for all ages to bring generations together, to make sure that literally all the generations are exposed to one another. They want to bring the seniors back into community because one of the lessons they learned was, of course, the health risk of disease, but also the health risks of loneliness and social isolation. So they've gone the opposite way. That was the lesson. One of the hardest cities in the world where came away from COVID with the notion that bringing people together is, in some ways, the best medicine.
Well, as difficult the epidemic was for all of us and our families and the loved ones we lost, perhaps there's something to say about the human condition, that we bounce back. People bounce back and they embrace that human connection, and that's just there's hope for all generations. And I'd like to leave this session, Ken. I can't thank you enough for joining us in the CindyXR Wellness community here. The lessons learned and the book, and I highly recommend your book, Healthy to 100, Lessons from the World's Healthiest Countries. I'd like to leave our session today, Ken, with a little bit about your wellness journey. I've always fascinated to see people's journey and how we end up together here. And I know you're a lawyer by trade. We mentioned your prior experience as a CEO of NPR and the Longevity Project and the Centralized podcast and best-selling author. It occurs to me that if there's a thread between of this, and certainly listening to you today, there's a lot of storyteller in Ken Stearns. And tell us a little bit about your journey and perhaps how this focus on longevity has affected you personally.
Yeah, so I would say, Chris, in terms of my journey, the interesting thing for me is like I didn't really find my passion until I was about 50. I was a lawyer, I was in politics, I was in government. I spent a decade at NPR running it. And at NPR, I was at a place where I was managing people who told stories, but not actually telling the stories myself. And that seemed like the way it should be until I left NPR and I discovered actually sort of my joy in trying to tell stories and writing books and doing podcasts and newsletters and Instagram accounts. And that I really love it. I think I have a modest talent for it, for telling stories that I think I hope expose some larger truths about human nature. And that gives me the sort of, I think, in prior millennia, I would hit 50 and probably that would be the end of my life expectancy. And I probably would never have the opportunity to to do this next act, which has been sort of the last 12 years. So I think that for me is sort of the biggest part of my journey of thinking about longer life. But I think now what I do is, and that has encouraged me is to do what I do, which is talk a lot about how the second half of life can be as important, meaningful, and as socially beneficial as the first, which is really what the Longevity Project is about, is trying to foster great understanding of that opportunity for a lot of people and the need for social systems that support people as they reinvent themselves, do new things, try new things, and try to stay healthy and purposeful in this much longer life we have. I think people lose sight of the fact that longevity is one of the greatest accomplishments of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, around 1900, life expectancy was only about 41 or 42. It's 79 now. We've added more years to life in the last 120 years than all of human history before that. It's an extraordinary thing. But now we have to learn how to take opportunity of that, take the opportunity to really live that longer life to its fullest. And I think that's an exciting opportunity for all of us.
Indeed, it is. And the quote that we'll end with from your book, longevity isn't just about adding years to your life. It's about adding life to years through meaningful relationships. And I can't thank you, Ken, enough for reminding us all of that. You certainly have taken us on a journey. You've told very good stories, and I thank you for sharing that with us today. Thank you, sir.
Chris, thanks for having me on the podcast.